So before we dive into Lighthouse specifically, we need to get a fresh Laravel project created. So we're starting completely from scratch here. We're going to end up with two projects, one for the back end and one for the front end. And we're going to build the Nuxt app a little bit later on in the course, once we've got to grips with creating the schema out for our API. So let's go ahead and use the Laravel installer. You can see I've got this pulled in here. It doesn't really matter how you create a Laravel project, but I'm going to go ahead and say Laravel new jobs. So that's going to be our API project. So let's just wait for that to finish. Then we can open it up and start to get Lighthouse installed. Okay, that's all done. Let's cd into that directory and let's go ahead and just open this up and configure our database just before we do anything. So I'm using Postgres, so I'm going to switch over the database connection and port. Database name here is jobs. The username for me is just my full name and the password is empty. So let's go ahead and run our default migrations just to get that set up. Now I've already created the jobs database, so that's all done. All that's left to do is migrate that just so we have all the default tables in there and ready to go. So now that we've got that done, let's just open that up in the browser just to make sure that's all good, and it looks like it is working. Now we don't really need to worry too much about going into our app in the browser. The only thing that we're going to need to do is use the helper in a minute to run GraphQL queries. So let's go over to the docs and get Lighthouse installed, and just down the bottom here we'll see how to use the DevTools helper to get this working. So let's first of all pull in Lighthouse with Composer. So let's just come back over to the terminal and pull that in. After that's finished, we need to publish the default schema, which we'll take a look at in just a second. And the next part will be running a query so we can actually see that this works. So that's all pulled in. Let's go ahead and publish our assets, which will have created a default schema.graphql file, which we'll take a look at in just a second. Now, if you're using Lumen, which we're not, you can go ahead and update that. For IDE support, you can pull in the IDE helper. That does help if you want to pull that in. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let's pull that in. And yeah, we just need to pull in this dependency before we do that. We'll see this in action in just a bit. So let's go ahead and make sure we get that in before that. Okay, great, so that's all done. Let's go back over now and pull in the GraphQL DevTools, which are going to be absolutely essential to get this working. Oh, by the way, you can put in the plugin here for PHP Storm if you want GraphQL support. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull in the GraphQL Playground, which is going to be really useful. And once that's pulled down, we can pretty much just come over to /GraphQL Playground to test this out. So let's go over to jobs.test GraphQL Playground, and sure enough, you can see here I've got some of the tabs open from when I was creating this course, but I'll go ahead and get rid of them in just a minute. That's pretty much Lighthouse set up and ready to go. Now let's take a look in this GraphQL directory. We've got this schema definition in here. By default, this gives us a couple of query types here, so for users and for a particular user, and also defines out this user as well. Now this definition here tells us what columns we have within our user. We know that's pretty standard if you've worked with Laravel before. We have a name, we have an email address, we have an ID, and the way this works is the column names here map up to the column names in your model or your database table, depending on how you want to think about it, and the types here are GraphQL types. So we've got an ID, we've got a string for the name and email, and we've got a date time for created at. We also have things like Boolean as well, and we'll be diving into them a little bit later on in the course, but you'll see these a lot. They're basically just GraphQL types, and as you follow the course, if you are very new to GraphQL, that will help you out. Now this query is what we're going to look at in the next part. Now we've pretty much got this set up, we can go over and test this out with the playground over here. So let's go over and do that in the next part, just to make sure everything is set up and so we can understand how to query our GraphQL API.